Oak shade held none of the welcome Annalie had longed for on the ride home. She had left the road as soon as she knew where she was, and cut through fields and pastures to avoid anyone who might be looking for her. This circuitous path led her past the hill to which she'd taken Teague for an escape from morbid thoughts, the hill that she now saw with as little desire to climb it as Teague had felt then. She rode past the fenced enclosure where her father's cattle gathered around a temporary pond the rainy month had produced in a depression in the earth. The stupid creatures would rather return to that depression, which was now little more than mud, than walk a little bit further to the creek. Maybe they expected some miraculous reappearance of water, as if they could simply tap a rock and a spring would gush forth. Finally, she brought Benedict to a stop behind the house. The roses on the gazebo were starting to brown around the edges, for it was that time of year when her mother started her battle with the sun and humidity to keep them blooming until the fall. But this time Mamma wasn't at home to pull the faded blooms from the stems, or to keep a bucket full of water on the climbers every other evening. Annalie had often wondered why she was so intent on prolonging the blooming season of those roses. She didn't use them for cuttings any more, and they certainly weren't her favorite flowers to cultivate, since she complained of the insects they attracted every time she came in from watering. The browning red flowers covered the gazebo like a protruding wound in the earth, as if something had been torn up out of the flesh and quivered in the wind. Annalie would be glad when the fall came. Benedict felt the slackening of his reins in her hands, and began walking to the stable of his own accord. Annalie let him do as he willed until he stopped at the open doors. She wondered at the flies swarming in the dooryard until she nearly vomited at the smell of dung and urine left lying for days in the haste to move the horses to a safe hiding place. Instead of forcing Benedict into his stall, she simply removed his trappings and turned him loose in the pasture where he could find his own shelter from the heat. The late afternoon sun made a square of orange on the parlor floor where Mamma had taken up the rug to hide it. Annalie sat on the floor outside that square. The parlor furniture had been removed for fear that Morgan would burn down the house. She wished the curtains had been left in the window so she could shut out the sunshine. It had been too bright the whole ride home, especially those first few minutes after she left Davinia's shack. She had tried to keep her eyes on the road ahead, but the movement in the woods on either side of her made that impossible. Dozens of Negroes were walking through the underbrush toward the dead man's grave in Davinia's yard. Except for the rustling of the weeds around their feet, the people were silent, as though they were simply the shadows of the trees they moved through. Even though it was a Sunday, and they were going to bury one of their own, they didn't say a word about God or death or any of the things she thought they would talk about. A baby might have whimpered at the heat in his mother's arms. Someone might have coughed or sneezed or checked a sob at the thought of the stranger's family who would never know what became of him. But no one did anything to disturb the preternatural absence of human sound. They didn't even sing. Why didn't they sing? They sang a song for everything in Uncle Tom's cabin, so why didn't they even sing? It occurred to Annalie that instead of sitting here on the floor wondering at their silence, she might take advantage of the quiet that surrounded her now by making some pretense of Sunday observance. It would have been much easier to stay seated where she was than to get up and find a Bible to read until daylight failed, and she almost did opt for that ease before she remembered that she had not yet changed out of the bloody dress. Since she had to leave the floor to change clothes anyway, she stepped into Papa's library to get his Bible with all 30 years' worth of his annotations that would serve better at instruction than any sermon could do. But it wasn't at his desk. The only things she saw there were a stack of letter paper and his pen and ink. She didn't concern herself about its absence as much as she thought she should, but focused instead on the case where Papa kept the family's medicine. There was the container she'd seen Teague eyeing more than once. She had been angry that he seemed so eager to disobey Papa, that he deliberately took more pills than he ought. But now she thought perhaps she was ill-equipped to make that judgment. She knew what the medical books said opium would do, relieve pain through sedation, but she'd never had occasion to test the effects for herself. One pill couldn't do much more than a dose of laudanum, surely. What could two hurt, for that matter? And Annalie couldn't deny the aches in her back and legs, even if she wanted to deny the ache that actually drove her to try Teague's method of relief. She couldn't swallow them whole for the dryness that came to her throat the moment she resolved to open the medicine case, so she had to chew and wince at the taste. She climbed the steps to her bedroom then, justifying more warmly every moment Teague's predilection to opening his pill case, now that she'd done it herself. By the time she'd hidden the bloody dress under her mattress and pulled on her nightgown, he had become just slightly less sympathetic a sufferer than Jesus in the garden. No, that must have been the medicine starting to take effect. She lay down on her side with the aim of propping her own Bible up beside her to look for a more apt point of comparison for Teague's suffering. But she never opened the book, only stared at the cover and tried to impress herself with an endeavor to recall every mention of pain according to book and chapter. She made it up to Ecclesiastes before deciding to rest her eyes for a minute, and then becoming insensible to light, sound, and every element of sensation for the next 18 hours. Her re-entry to the waking world was not what she expected. For an hour or more she could not distinguish reality from dreams. She fell off Benedict and stirred up the dust in the road at the same time that she told herself it had never happened. She watched the procession of shadowy mourners become trees and begged them to take her with them until one little boy pulled her by the hand into his shadow, and she watched in horror while her arm disappeared into darkness. She thought she woke up then, but she was back holding the dying man's blood vessels and shutting her eyes against the constant red pumping. Gradually the warmth of the blood spread from her fingers and up into her left wrist. She watched the blood gush up her arm, making her skin melt into the wound, and she yelled for herself to wake up. Then she cried because yelling would not work, and tried to pull her hands away to force open her eyes. When she finally did wake, her left arm was numb from where she had lain on it for so long, but she dared not move for several seconds for fear that some other nightmare would shoot up from the end of her bed. But then she realized that she was sweating under the cover, and that the room had acquired that heaviness it got in the late morning when she had neglected to open the windows for a breeze. Annalee stood and stared out the closest window. The sun was too bright again today, more so perhaps because her pupils had not quite adjusted after her unnatural sleep. So she rigged blankets up over the windows and covered herself up over her head on the side of the bed that wasn't wet with perspiration. In the dim grayness, she watched her hands with their still bloody cuticles hold the cover far enough from her face to keep her from smothering, but close enough for her to feel the heat and moisture of her breath reflected back from the cloth. She hadn't been able to save him, hadn't done anything remotely intelligent, except to say that her hands were dirty, and that was only because Papa was so fastidious about washing his hands before treating a patient. He joked that maybe the Pharisees were right on the importance of hand-washing, in that laughing way he had of covering the great blame he placed on himself for his first wife's death. But even her worry about cleanliness had been nonsensical. Blood poured, not trickled, but poured from the man's leg, and she'd said her hands were dirty. How stupid, how useless she had been. How unnecessary she always had been. The only moments she seemed reasonably interesting were when she posed as someone else. For that was what she did, really. She played pretend that she could even approach the essence of Tom, when in reality she couldn't begin to touch the character, the wit, the very life of him. And despite this complete lack of substance, she had convinced herself that she could help Teague. Oh yes, she was a fine Christian example indeed, when she could think ill of him for storming off when she spoke of God, and then pray for him while somewhere a part of her knew it was just to spite his contempt for her beliefs. He was, without question, her better. Yes, he used his opium as an escape from affliction that was likely more nervous than physical, but she had just done the same. And yes, he openly disdained all shows of civility when dealing with people who were in every way except pretense beneath him. But the only thing that kept her from bursting other people's pomposity was that she was too mealy-mouthed to do it. He questioned every form of authority, even the highest. Here surely she could find some solace, for not even when Tom died did she doubt. But then here, too, she could fault herself, for hadn't she gloated over him in that unflagging belief? Hadn't she, in trying to set an example and impart her faith to him, sometimes thought of the effort as another jewel in her crown? save him. She could no more save him than she could save the dead man on the table. She could no more save him than she could save herself. "I am not a Pharisee," she said aloud. But when she closed her eyes, she couldn't help seeing herself looking to the sky, thanking God she was not as other people, while Teague stood on his one leg, too broken in spirit to lift up so much as his eyes, yet closer to heaven than she would ever be.